Well, good morning and afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our third Lunch and Learn session of Donor Experience Week. My name is Mel Bilko. If you haven't already met me, I am Keela's Head of Community Engagement, and I'll be the moderator of today's session. We also have Ines on the background of things. If you have any technical questions, you'll probably see her in the chat. But before I do get started, I want to start by acknowledging that here in Vancouver, we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and also the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. We're super excited to have you all participating in Keela's 5-day virtual conference. I hope you have been enjoying all of these wonderful sessions that we've been putting on. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that Keela's main focus since COVID-19 has been on education, empowering nonprofits through this new normal, events, putting on events like Donor Experience Week. But we are also launching Keela U, which is a free crash course dedicated for small to medium-sized nonprofits looking to grow their skills, be more analytical, and become more, agile in these digital times. So you can sign up for the first session, the first chapter of Keela U, which is set to be released next week, by following the link, which I believe Ines is just about to pop into the chat there. All right, and with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's Lunch and Learn. Today we have Alex Corner joining us from Venngage. Alex is a content marketer at Venngage, the online infographic software. If you haven't heard about them, please check them out. And previous to her role at Venngage, she worked in a variety of nonprofit marketing roles, and she is passionate about amazing communication. In Alice's session today, titled Designing for Accessibility, How to Make Your Communications Accessible and Inclusive, as you can see in the slide. In this interactive session today, Alice will walk us through how to make your communications more accessible in order to be an inclusive employer and to reach bigger external audiences. We encourage you to ask questions throughout, and we'll probably leave the Q&A session towards the end because Alice was just telling me she typically gets a ton of questions during these kind of sessions. So please pop them into the Q&A, the chat. Make sure you do select all panelists and attendees if you want everyone to see your question, which is preferred. And with that, I think that is everything I needed to say. So with that, I will pass it off to Alice and let her take it away from here.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for that, Mel. Let me just share my screen with you and then we can get started. Cool. Bear with me 1 second while I get this to share. There's always technical issues at the start of this, isn't there? Mel, I think I'm going to have to rejoin the meeting really quickly, so give me 1 second.
No problem.
Okay, hi. Hopefully everybody can see this screen now.
We can.
Great. Okay, so hi everybody and welcome to this Lunch and Learn. Today I'm going to be talking about accessible design, and we're going to cover off different accessibility needs, and I'll provide loads of actionable advice and tips about making your internal and external comms better for people who live with autism, colour blindness, visual impairments, dyslexia, and more. So before we get started, I'd really love to know what your biggest roadblocks are in improving your communications accessibility. You can just pop them in the chat there and we can see, what everybody's struggling with when it comes to computer communications accessibility. Previously, we've had people say things like getting the stakeholders on board, finding time, how do you get the knowledge started? What about the budget? Is there room in the budget for that? Lots of different, communications problems when it comes to accessibility. So the main things that you're going to take away from this webinar are the different types of accessibility and their communication needs, how to create accessible internal digital comms, and how to create accessible marketing materials. a lot of these tips will also be useful for accessible web design and accessible marketing. I've put a bunch of these accessibility tips into practice during this webinar too, so you should get a good idea of what accessible design looks like in action, so hopefully you'll start to spot them as we go along. So a quick overview of the agenda, intro and housekeeping, that's where we are now. And then I'll talk through what we actually mean by accessible design. Then we'll cover off accessibility needs and give you some proof points of why accessible design is important. If you're looking for reasons to give your stakeholders for accessibility buy-in, this will be really important. Then we'll run through how you can improve your accessibility design in the form of an accessibility checklist. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So as an introduction to me, hi, I'm Alice and I'm content marketer at Venngage. I like writing about design and making videos about communications. If you want to find me on social media, my username is Blur, and I'm very passionate about accessibility. But I haven't always been a content marketer. Previously, I was an educator, and I taught non-neurotypical children key literacy and communication skills through filmmaking. And in that role, I learned so much about the unspoken communications that go on, and how, for some people, it can be difficult to fully process or understand. I've been passionate about accessibility for a long time, and coming from a background where I had first-hand experience with different communication styles, I was thrilled to be able to share this webinar with you. I hope you can all learn some new tips about accessibility, and I'm really excited to hear about your experiences. Now, before we get into how to make your designs accessible, let's talk about why you should. Did you know that 1 in every 4 Americans lives with a disability? It's thought that up to 15% of Americans have dyslexia, and a further 10% live with colour blindness. That's a huge amount of people that you're potentially excluding from your designs and communication materials. Accessible design is designs that are understood by everybody. We talk about accessibility a lot in terms of physical accessibility of a space or a business, but your internal and external comms should be easily understood by most people too. So, simply put, accessible design is a type of design that has taken into consideration how people are able to understand the information that's being presented. So what are some of the different accessibility needs when we're talking about accessible design? A couple of the key ones are colour blindness, dyslexia, visual impairments, neurodiversity, and autism. There will be more, and accessibility is a spectrum, so individual requirements will differ. If you're designing for accessibility for an individual, it's always best to talk to that person and work out how you can help them best. One good analogy is to think of accessibility like a colour wheel. Everyone lies in a different colour, but it's not linear. While there may be some accessibility overlaps, not everything will be applicable for everybody. This is why design accessibility probably isn't as common as it should be, because it can be a really hard thing to wrap your head around, and even harder to identify universal adjustments that work for everybody on this colour spectrum. So what are the different types of accessibility we'll be talking about today? Colour blindness is when a person has difficulties perceiving different types of colour. Colour blindness is commonly thought of as you can't see colour at all and life is in black and white, but actually it's a lot more to do with being unable to see one specific light range of colour. Without getting too technical about it, our eyes can only process light through 3 receptors, the red, the green, and the blue. So if one of those receptors doesn't work as expected, your understanding of colour will be different. The one you've probably heard of is red-green colour blindness, but there are other types too. People who live with colour blindness have different accessibility needs, as the colours that we use to signify difference or contrast often don't register for them. For example, this sales chart is all nice and colour-coded. And here's how people with red-green colour blindness would see it. You can just about make out the different segments, but our eyes are having to do a lot of work. So why make it more difficult for people if you could just pick one colour palette and stick with it that works for everybody? When it comes to dyslexia, the accessibility needs often lie within the text and the language, rather than the colour choices or design. Having said that, there are ways you can help dyslexic people understand information via design. For some people with dyslexia, the words appear to jump about on the page or become all muddled up, but there are ways in design that you can counteract that through using icons and spacing your text, and we're going to cover those off in this webinar. Visual impairments is another accessibility challenge that is unique to each person, ranging from full blindness to blurred vision, light sensitivity, or night blindness. The Braille Institute actually have this really cool app that lets you experience the internet through the eyes of somebody with visual impairments. So this is just an example of what a web page would look like for somebody with macular degeneration, but you can test it with any web page. Some of the ways to design communications that are accessible to people with visual impairments are using clear, simple fonts and adding alt text, as well as making use of visuals and distinct segments or sections in your documents. Neurodiversity is a term that's been bubbling around for a while, but it's starting to be used a lot more. Over the past few years, the term neurotypical has been used to describe how people who don't have autism, ADHD, or other neurological processing problems. However, this framing is quite problematic as it's alienating for people who are autistic or have ADHD or dyslexia or any other amount of differences in their neurological functioning. By using the term neurodiversity, we're talking about the idea that there isn't one right way to function a process, and that differences in neurology are as common as differences in gender, sex, or race. Neurodiversity contains a whole spectrum of processing differences, and often you'll hear people talk about high or low functioning autism. Each individual will be different in how they process communications, but hopefully I can give you some more general tips that are broadly applicable to everybody. Some of the main communication challenges that people who live with autism can face are things like feeling like there's too much information or an information overload, pragmatics, the appropriate use of language in social situations, such as being able to stay on topic and take turns in a conversation, unspoken language, the difficulty understanding social cues, body language, sarcasm, or figurative speech. ADHD is most commonly associated with hyperactivity, but it presents itself in lots of ways, including short attention spans, being easily distracted, and struggling to follow a thread or stay engaged. Like I said before, everybody is different and their accessibility needs will vary. But by attending this webinar, you've already taken the first step in accessible communications, which is just to be aware of the fact that communications should be accessible. So well done for showing an interest and being willing to learn. So what are some of the reasons that accessible design is important? Reaching a bigger external audience is key if you're looking to grow or expand your business, especially if you're a company that relies on organic marketing or a nonprofit looking for donors, such as you all are. Making sure that the most people possible understand your marketing seems like an easy win. Lots of employers offer accommodations for employees with disabilities, but often the focus is on visible disabilities. How many employers make sure that people who are dyslexic or have visual impairments can thrive in the workplace? It's something that you should be thinking about proactively. Many companies and countries will have to comply with legal requirements around accessibility as well. These differ for each industry and location, so you'll have to have a check into those yourself, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind. As more people move to remote work, it's more important than ever to make sure your comms and materials are clear and understandable for your entire workforce. Previously, if an employee didn't understand something, they could lean across their desk and ask somebody else. But since that's no longer an option, you need to make sure that you're supporting all of your own employees by making your comms accessible from the start. Working remotely is an alienating experience anyway, so try to avoid adding more difficulties on top for your staff. Okay, so let's get into some accessible design top tips. So the first tip is a really simple one. Use simple sans serif fonts in your design. The difference between a serif and a sans serif font is that serifs have little ledges on the edge of the letter. The top example here is a serif font and the bottom is a sans serif font. Throughout this presentation, I've been using sans serif fonts and you'll see why in a second. Taking a look at this example, it's really clear that font B is easier to read, especially when you get down to the smaller font sizes. Making your columns accessible means that people should be able to read them, so starting with a sans serif font is definitely the first place that you should start. In this example from HubSpot, they've chosen a font that is super easy to read for the social media graphics, which is especially handy when people are going to be looking at them on their phone, which is a much smaller screen. So making sure that the font is easy to comprehend even at small sizes is really important. Which brings us nicely onto our next tip, which is use large font sizes. This infographic is a great example of using large fonts for clarity. Even though the rest of the text, which is what we call the body copy, is smaller, the headers are large, easy to read, and include enough information that you understand each section. It's really easy to see what the differences are. The next tip is to avoid patterned or complicated backgrounds. This is the same chart but with different backgrounds. The patterned background with a gradient on the left looks cool, but it makes the text in the chart quite difficult to understand, whereas the one on the right is much easier because the background has a good contrast and is simple. Making sure that people can understand your difficult charts is really important in accessibility, especially if you need to share important financial information or important progress with people. Speaking of which, our next tip is make sure that you use strong contrasting colours. Especially for people with colour blindness, it can be difficult to perceive colour contrasts. This red and green palette on the top line looks fine, but below is how people who live with colour blindness would perceive the chart, which isn't great. You know, if you want to make something stand out, you definitely need to make sure that you're thinking about using a different contrasting colour. Try and pick colours that are polar opposites on the colour wheel, like blue and yellow. You can apply this sort of idea to lots of different things, and there's tools on the internet that you can use to help check the colour contrast for various visual impairments and colour blindness on the internet, which is really handy as well. Another thing you can do instead of picking alternate colours is you can show differences using shades or patterns. So instead of relying solely on colour to show difference, use different shades and patterns. In the chart on the left, we can clearly see the different sections, even though they're all the same colour, because they're using different shades. We've got the green, the very light green, we've got the medium green, and we've got the dark grey green. And even if somebody does have colour blindness, they can still clearly see the difference in the shades. In the chart on the right, we've got different patterns altogether, which really helps make things stand out. Differentiating the blocks with different patterns is really, really handy like this. Basically, anything you can do to make it more distinctive. The next tip is to use icons wherever possible. Icons are also really important for your accessible designs because icons help provide context for text. Icons can be used to quickly illustrate a situation or an action or give directions in a situation. Icons can also be quickly understood at a glance. Icons are also really handy because they don't require good knowledge of language to understand them. That's why when you see things like fire exits or emergency signs, they're mostly done in icons rather than text. So adding icons to your designs or any of your communications materials can help provide context and guide the narrative for somebody who doesn't have a high comprehension of language. Icons are especially helpful if you don't have access to good quality stock photography or any in-house images, which is definitely a problem for a lot of smaller nonprofits not being able to have good quality stock photography. Visuals in whatever form they come in are always more compelling than text alone, so making sure that you use them is really smart. I've just included a couple examples of a landing page and a newsletter here that don't use photography but still communicate the message with visuals. The next tip is to add alt text to your images. So alt text is alternative text that shows up when an image is unable to be viewed through either technical faults or due to vision impairment. This example from the University of Leicester shows an example of bad and good alt text. The more descriptive your alt text, the better. The way that it works is that if somebody is unable to read a screen, they can use a tool called a screen reader. Most of our phones, especially iPhones, have screen readers built in, so you can use those to check to see what your website looks like. But the screen reader will narrate what the contents of the website is out loud for the person with a visual impairment. So making sure that you add alt text to images makes sure that they aren't missing out on 50% of the web page or the columns. Alt text should be descriptive, specific, and accurate. Writing good alt text is definitely a skill, and there's lots of good resources online that you can use to get more accurate at that. But basically make sure that you sufficiently describe what's going on and what any of the key information is. And if you've included text in your image, it's probably worth including that in the alt text as well. So the next tip is to use consistent layouts. So both of these pages contain the same information, but the one on the left is so much easier to read. Consistent layouts help people with neurodiversity, especially autism and ADHD, and dyslexia, understand the information better, as they're able to follow the flow easier. Predictability in layout is one of the quickest and easiest things you can do in terms of accessibility. Making sure that people know what to expect, especially when it comes to layout, helps people understand the information better. Another tip you can use is to add double spaces in between words. So this is more of a personal thing, but some people, especially those with dyslexia, are helped by double spacing in between words. It doesn't make a lot of difference to your text appearance, but it helps separate the words into individual chunks a lot easier, and it helps avoid the muddled up text feeling that a lot of people with dyslexia experience. As I said, this isn't something that works for everybody. Some people really like it, some people it doesn't benefit for. So if you're designing for somebody in particular, then definitely ask them, but it doesn't make that much of a difference, so it can't really hurt to do. Another way that you can help make your communications more accessible is to avoid large paragraphs of text. Honestly, our brains get tired all of the time, even if you don't have processing difficulties. Breaking text into smaller sections with paragraph headers where appropriate helps everybody understand the documents better. It helps people skim the documents and it adds context to each paragraph. You can also use bold of the important points or contrasting colours to help make things stand out in this format. So I'm just going to quickly recap those because I know that was a lot of information in one go. So use simple fonts. Make sure your fonts are simple and sans serif if possible. Don't use embellishments or fancy designs, and make sure they're large enough to read from a distance. Use a good text hierarchy where the most important information is the largest. Big, clear fonts should be used for headers. Make sure that people can read what you're saying. Using icons and images is a really great way to add context to your information or to illustrate instructions. Icons and images should be used wherever possible to illustrate or enhance what you're communicating. You probably noticed on these slides that I used more icons than text, especially at the beginning where I was explaining the different types of accessibility needs. It really helped me explain some of the more difficult concepts around communication without making this document too text heavy. Different symbols have different meanings as well, but symbols and icons are practically universally understood, so make sure that you use them. Adding alt text to a landing page or an image for further clarification is especially important with digital materials. With things like Twitter's character limit and Facebook's no more than 20% of an image should be text rule, adding alt text is a really easy way to provide extra information and context to people who aren't able to view your images. And when we talk about alt text, we are mostly talking about people who use screen readers for visual impairments, but it's also really handy for people who don't have access to reliable internet and they struggle to load text image heavy sites. Having the alt text there is another alternative. They can still access your materials. So when you're trying to communicate with people, you want to make sure they fully understand what you're saying. So make sure that you add as much alt text as possible. Avoid large chunks of text in your designs. It's easy to lose focus and concentration when you're just looking at large blocks of text. Creating shorter paragraphs and using headings can help you keep the focus on the information. Using icons and colors to help break up your text and provide context or an anchor to the subject is also another way you can make your text more appealing. Obviously, there will be some situations where long paragraphs are unavoidable, but wherever possible, try and break things up into smaller, more manageable chunks. Pick your colors carefully when designing. Check to make sure your palettes are suitable for people who live with colour blindness, and check to make sure there's enough of a contrast as well. Consider using patterns or shades to help indicate difference rather than relying on colour alone. Even when you're designing your brand and picking a logo, it's important to think about how this will be viewed as well. Will there be enough contrast in your logo or your brand for people to be able to access it? And when it comes to colours, less is often more. Pick a few key colours to use throughout your designs and make sure that your materials are legible and consistent. And finally, ask. Never be afraid to ask questions about accessibility. If you're mostly creating internal comms, why not send out a survey asking if people have any accessibility requirements, such as colour blindness? It can be completely anonymous. If you're talking to an audience more generally, you can also create this sort of survey on a social media or in a newsletter list, asking if there's anything that you aren't currently doing that would help your audience access you easier. If this is something you don't really feel like you can do, maybe check in with a lot of the authoritative sites on the website. I know the Braille Institute have lots of good resources. There's a lot of different websites for people who live with autism about accessibility as well. And there's really active and engaging communities around those as well. So if it's a particular concern, you can always find somebody to check in with. Like I said earlier, the first step of making the world a bit more of an accessible place is being willing to learn how. So never be afraid to ask. So I know that was a very quick run through. I assume there's a couple of questions that people will have about this, and I'd really love to answer them. So we've got about 15 minutes now to answer any questions that you may have.
Yes, thank you so much, Alice. That was really helpful. I'm sure that a lot of people learned many new things today. We do have a question coming in from Laura. They are saying, I had understood that large blocks of prose should use serif to guide your eyes, whereas short blocks, so headings, call to action, should use sans serif. Is sans serif now the most recommended for all types of text to improve accessibility?
It depends on who you're talking to is really the answer to that one. As like I said, everybody has different accessibility needs, but also this is quite a not very well understood area. You know, there's so many different types of accessibility needs that there isn't room in the world so far for everybody to know everything about everybody. So, for example, the guidance used to be to use Comic Sans as a font. And recently, a lot of people have started saying, actually, I have dyslexia and I don't find Comic Sans helpful. So again, with the advice with serif and sans serif, definitely always make your headers sans serif if possible, because they need to be really clear and legible. I'm not completely sure on the serif for the body copy. If it's something that people find helpful, I think definitely do. If it can be avoided without it looking too jarring, maybe try serif, sans serif. It's one of those things that unfortunately I don't have a straight yes, do this answer, because everybody's so completely different that it really depends on your audience. But I think as long as you make as much as possible legible by using those big headers and making sure that you cut your prose into lots of smaller chunks and use visuals wherever possible, that should be enough to help guide the rest of the process.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's good. Very good points. The next question is coming from Melanie, and I'm not 100% sure if you'll be able to answer this because it's more about video, but I'll let you give it a shot. What are the key things to consider when making video accessible?
Yeah, so making video accessible, I actually run the Venngage YouTube channel as well. There's lots of lovely videos of me on there talking. And this is something we've been thinking about a lot recently, how we can make our video more accessible for people. So making sure you add captions is definitely important. Another thing that we've been starting to do is in the YouTube descriptions, we've been breaking out the video into segments and timestamping it so people can find the information quicker, almost as if they're skimming, you know, a piece of text. You want to be able to skim the video in the same way. If there's an important point that I'm making in a video as well, I always make sure that I put the text on the screen as well as say it out loud. It's kind of just covering my bases there, but making sure that people have access to that information that I really want them to retain in more ways possible is probably erring on the safe side, but you know, it can't hurt. So sometimes I'll have like a video of me and then I'll have the text alongside me, or sometimes I'll cut to a kind of a slideshow with the important information on. And making sure that I say it out loud as well is really important, because you know, it helps for people who need to listen as well as read. So kind of just covering all your bases. We also, so yeah, the other thing that we do is we also show a lot of examples in our videos. Like I did in this presentation as well, I could sit here and say, you know, it's important to use a bold font, but if I can show an example of what a bold font looks like versus not a bold font, or what it can look like in application, that's really helpful as well, making sure that everybody fully understands what you're talking about when you're talking about it, and making sure that, you know, you really take an almost beginner's approach to how you're explaining things, and just assume that the people watching the video are coming in with zero information, and showing them everything that you can possible.
That's great.
So, yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, that helped. I'm sure that did. Okay, so the next question from Christina. We produce a number of reports and were recently made aware that our reports are not working with screen readers. We work with an independent graphic designer. Are there specific things we should be asking them to do when they create the documents for us? The reports are, the reports are a combination of text, images, charts, and tables.
So that's an interesting one. I think it depends on how you're sharing your reports. And there's different ways and different forms of PDF that you can add alt text. And this kind of goes for every platform. If you Google a specific platform like MailChimp or like this sort of PDF plus alt text, there'll always be a really detailed guide on how to add it effectively. So it would kind of depend, I think, in that case, about how you're sharing them. Another alternative that you could do if it's not working through a PDF format is you could create a web page with all the report information, including the visuals, just on your website, and you can include a link to that in your report, sort of, you know, with the caveat, here's the web version for people with screen readers, here's how you can access this information. So having more options available in that case would be what I'd probably recommend. But it would be something to check in with on the technical side, I think.
Thank you. That's great. A question from our team. Someone on our team, where can I find color palettes that are color blindness rather friendly?
Yeah.
Any resources out there?
Yeah, so there's loads of resources. We actually have one on the Venngage blog that is a bunch of curated color palettes for different occasions that are suitable for different types of color blindness. And I showed one example earlier, but you know, we've got a bunch of them that you can pick from. Another really good website that I like is Colors, but it's spelled with two O's. It's like COOLORS. And they are a kind of a digital tool to create color palettes. But what you can do is you can put in any color palette and it'll show you how it looks for people who suffer with color blindness, and it'll give you alternatives as well. So if you're looking to update, you know, an existing website, you can kind of pull into there and see how it looks. And if you're looking to create from scratch, you know, definitely check out the ones that we have on Venngage.
Wonderful. We don't have too many more questions. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more just about what Venngage does. I'm curious. I know that you talked about lots of like graphics, adding graphics to your communication. So yeah, I would love to hear more.
Yeah, of course. So we are an online infographics tool first and foremost, but we actually do a lot of visual communication materials. So we have an online editor and lots of templates that you can pick that have all been designed by professional designers, and you can put your own information into them. But especially since, you know, the world went remote and everything moved online, we've really noticed an uptick in people creating sort of more communications materials, things like, you know, making letterheads or making reports or things that need to be communicated that used to be in person, and how you can kind of balance that shift online. So one of the things that we do have is we have a bunch of different templates for nonprofits specifically, you know, different things like everything from a Gantt chart to a like marketing plan for the next 6 months of how you can make that design visually appealing. And, you know, putting into practice all of the tips that I've gone through before is really easy as well, because you can change the colors and add icons. I mean, I created this entire presentation on Venngage myself, and I'm not a designer. So it's a really handy way to do that. And, you know, we have been thinking a lot about accessibility, which is why I'm so excited to be able to be hosting this sort of webinar, and how we can help people access that within our tool as well.
Great. And is the product free, or do you have to pay a monthly subscription?
We have a free version that you can try out, and then we have a business version as well, which is geared towards organizations. It has things like team collaboration. It has, you know, you can create different teams and you can all work on the same document, and then you can share it and make edits. And we've got a bunch of different icons and stock photography options as well.
Awesome, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I might just end it there. I'll keep monitoring the Q&A and the chat box in case any more questions come in while I kind of wrap things up. Alice, I don't know if you had any kind of last words that you wanted to say before I wrap it up here, but.
Yeah. So first of all, like, thank you for everybody who has shown an interest in accessible design. I know that was a lot of information quite quickly, but, you know, we do have a more detailed blog post on this entire subject that I wrote that has, you know, links to reports and examples. But if anybody does have any more specific questions, definitely, you know, let the team know, and I'd really love to be able to answer those and talk more thoroughly about how you can make your communications accessible.
Absolutely, and we've thrown the link there to one of your blogs in the chat box, so everyone can kind of take a look as well. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. All right, well, thank you again so much, Alice. That was honestly really interesting, and I'm really hoping that our team can also utilize all that you've helped us gain knowledge of, so thank you. Just a reminder, everyone, that there will be a quick little survey at the end once this presentation closes. We'd love to hear any of your feedback. It is anonymous. I'm sure Alice would love to hear your feedback as well. It definitely helps us improve all of these sessions for you. And we will see you. We have our next session in about 15 minutes or so with George Weiner from Whole Whale. So really excited about that one. So please feel free to sign up for that one if you already haven't. I'm just going to let Ines pop that link into the chat there. Hopefully she does in a second. And while we wait for that, I'll just let you all know that I'll remind you all that this session was also recorded. So don't worry if you missed anything. If you didn't take notes, we will send it to you in a follow-up email. We'll also send the slide deck as well. And I believe by the end of the week, you should be getting it along with all of the other presentations as well, all the recordings, all of the sessions. Oh, there, Ines popped that link into the chat there. So if you want to sign up for George's session, that's happening in about 15 minutes. And I think with that, we will end it off. Alice, thanks again so much. It was a pleasure to have you. Excited to work with you, hopefully more in the future. And I'll let you say any final words before we head off here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And we will see you next time.